as we talk about the Myers-Briggs, it's important to remember that it's not a personality test in the sense of depression and anxiety and somaticism and obsessive-compulsive behavior, that type of pathology that we sometimes talk about. But instead, it talks about how we operate. There's no right or wrong, no good or bad. It's how everybody operates in one way, shape, or form. And the object is to understand how we operate so that we can understand how others react to us, and to understand how others operate so that we can adjust our behavior at times, or at least our understanding what's going on in the situation. So it's a way to understand. That's the most important thing to learn about this test, is that it's not a classical psychological test. It's something to be helpful for everyone. The Myers-Briggs test was developed in the early part of this century. You'll probably recognize the first name on there as Carl Jung, who was an Austrian psychiatrist, an associate of Sigmund Freud's. And when he was writing, he started some of his work on the types of personalities that people have. And he particularly started talking about introverts and extroverts. And we'll talk about that later. At the same time, Catherine Cook Briggs was doing studies also on personality type, and hers was less stringent research-wise, but she read some of Carl Jung's ideas, and they matched very well with what she was doing. She added a little bit to it and developed this test. The woman listed under there, Isabel Briggs Myers, is Catherine's daughter. And you'll see there behind there some initials you're going to learn about in the course of this presentation. The first one is an I, and that stands for introvert. If you look down almost from the bottom, there's a fellow, Jerry Malone there. He has an E, that stands for extrovert. And we'll go on to some of the other things as we get along here. The other letters stand for things that we'll be learning about too. The Myers-Briggs is meant to give insight into who I am, and it opens doors into the self. The other factor it's supposed to help us each do is to give insight into others, how we'll relate to them, whether it's in our family or in our school, in an institutional structure like the military, a church, a business. All those places are interesting to take your knowledge and to understand and work with people. Now, first on here is extroversion. Now, as we look at a scale, I'm just going to put this up here. We're overriding, it doesn't matter. You'll see there's a scale up here on the very top. It goes from 70 to 30, E to I on that top line. All of these scales talk about two extremes. In this case, it's extroversion and introversion. And there's a continuum along there. You can be an extreme introvert, a moderate introvert, or a very introvert. Now, as we look at that, the extrovert and the introvert are really ways of looking at where do people gain their strength, where do they recuperate, where do they gain their power. An extrovert is someone who gains their energy from the external world. And on the other hand, the introvert is someone who gains their power from the internal world. And you can probably start to think about which you are right now just by thinking about when you go out to a dance or to a party. Do you approach it with dread, like I have to associate with people? Or is it something you look forward to, and while you're there, you really feel enthralled and energized, and you come away from there with all sorts of energy? That's an extrovert. An introvert is someone who can obviously go to parties and dances, things of that sort, and they can enjoy them, depending how extreme they are. But then, they need time to recuperate afterwards, to say, I'm going to get some energy back. I'm going to have to be by myself and regroup here. Extroversion means that people trust the outer world, the people around them. They get together with groups to do projects. There's a lot of public disclosure, a lot of speaking up and being heard. People who are extroverts are generally outgoing. If you walk into your friendly used car dealer, he comes up and puts his arm on your shoulder, how do you feel? Is that okay with you? Or when somebody puts their hand on your shoulder, do you sort of want to shrink away? And if you want to shrink away a bit and not trust that other person who hasn't even introduced themselves yet, then you're probably an introvert. People who are extroverted are more outgoing, more extemporaneous in their speaking. They don't mind just being called on in the middle of a group because they feel real comfortable communicating with other people. And they're more likely to have a multiplicity of relationships. That's to be involved with a whole lot of people. Introverts tend to be involved with one or two people, but very often very intensely, because they still need that contact, but they don't want to spread themselves too thin. And when there is disclosure about who I am and how I feel, it's more likely to be one-on-one. An introvert will say, gee, I feel like just talking to one person at a time rather than a couple at a time. I'm an introvert. And when I leave today, I'll need time to sit down and regroup myself. One of the other things you need to know about introverts is they don't deal well with confusion in a room. A lot of noise. And you need to know that about me. I really don't deal well with that. The next string here is sensing versus intuitive. Now, it's interesting to think about a sensing type and intuitive. If they're both witnesses at a bank robbery, a sensing person looks at details. They look at what qualifies an experience. So at a bank robbery, the police love to have extremely sensing people there for witnesses. The police go in and say, who is the bank robber? And they'll say, she was 6'2", had green eyes, brown hair, half had a streak through it, etc. Right down to the cuticle that wasn't cut on the left finger. Now, the intuitive, on the other hand, will see the same details, and in the police interview, the intuitive will say, well, you know, he was really an awful man. He just wasn't nice at all. And one person described the whole picture. He wasn't nice at all, what he did. The other person went for the details. Sensing people trust their senses. They tend to take things very literally, and they describe things in detail. You ask a sensing person, an extreme sensing person, to describe their bedroom, they'll describe it in detail, where glasses are in the room that were left from last night, what pictures are on the wall. An intuitive person will say, it's a mess. They tend to be quite practical in their orientation, very much focused in the here and now. What's going on right this minute? And on the other hand, intuitives tend to be theorizers. They take the little details, but then they draw big pictures out of it. And they find out what the focus is going on. They look at possibilities. They look at metaphor, thinking of things in pictures, and describing things overall. There's an interesting little piece I read across, written as though there was a sensing person and an intuitive person talking. The sensing person says, what time is it? The intuitive person says, it's late. The sensing person says, somewhat surprised, what time is it? And they'll also look at consequences. If I pick this up in the store without paying for it, I might get arrested. They seek clarity. They ask to have things explained in detail so that they can fit the pieces together to come to a conclusion. They tend to look for knowledge in what they do. On the other hand, a feeling person is a person who tends to make decisions based not on outcome and how I'm going to get there, but rather on how are the people going to feel that are affected by the decision. They're going to think about how they feel about the decision. They're going to think about how the person feels about the process. I was talking...
Yes, thank you. You want to see? Yeah, turn it off.
I need a pair of lights.
We can't even see that, Miss Frank.
Difficult to see that, Becky.
Can we...
Maybe turn the last one on.
Yeah, that would...
Turn them off. Turn them off. Turn them off. Keep it off.
We can't see that.
No?
That doesn't show up.
I'm sitting here like, get some, like,
All right,
Well,
hit the picture.
Go ahead, turn the lights off. I'll do this in the dark.
Say something smart. Go ahead, I dare you. I dare you.
I felt like a large part of my life is spent in the dark anyway. Okay. So we have thinking and feeling. Now the feeling person is going to make decisions, as I was saying, based on how people feel. And so as one of the students helping me make any difference, I'll ignore them, and they'll set up a triage situation so that the most people can be saved. Now, you can imagine that in some situations it's better to be a thinker, but in some situations you want a feeler there. If you want to talk about your problems, your most interpersonal dilemmas in life, you want somebody who's going to listen to your feelings and cares about where you're coming from and operates and understands and thinks first about feelings and then about thinking to help you deal with that. People can use both sides. Thinking people who go predominantly to thinking, that doesn't mean they don't feel and they don't care about people, but they're going to probably try to help that person and be sympathetic with them by helping them solve their problem and working it through logically. A feeling person, on the other hand, that doesn't mean they can't think. They can be very logical, they can solve problems and be engineers, but they're going to say, how's it going to affect people? Probably the person who, maybe invents a Vulcan gun that shoots 6,000 rounds a second is not going to be a feeler. He's going to be the person inventing the X-ray machines and the medical equipment. They both take thinking, but one will have a certain logic, so they'll be more concerned about people and how they use themselves. Go ahead. On the last scale, there's only 4 scales here. We have judging versus perceiving. A judging person is systematic, they're decisive, they want to end with closure. They'll come to a quick decision because they want things to be tied up, and once you got them tied up in a neat package, then you can go on and work with that package, that machine, that logic to get the problem solved. They're time conscious. When they ask a judging person what time it is, and they'll probably tell you down to the last second very often. They're orderly. They keep things on their desk in a certain order, or in their locker. They want things wrapped up and be on time. They look for what can be improved in a situation, or what's good about it. They're critical in that way. They think critically. And they tend to think in a very fixed way, particularly at the extreme ends. A person who's a judging person who's asked, what do you use bricks for? They'll say, well, you use them to build buildings. And some people use them for making sidewalks. On the other hand, the perceiving person will say, bricks are wonderful things. You can use them for spacing in bookshelves. Better out there, so I'm going to take care of it by not making a decision right now. They're always looking for more data. And that makes sensing people about 50% of that 10 people are going to be feelers, so that cuts it down to 5. And about 45% are going to be receiving types, so that maybe cuts it down to about 2 people who are going to be I and FP. And that becomes important because there's some groups that are very large and some groups that are very small in the makeup. What I thought I'd do at this point is give you back your scores, and we're going to do this by having you get out of your seats. And what I'm going to do is A to F. Now don't move. And before we even go on, as people come back to their seats and turn around and become part of the group again, I wanted to thank a number of the students here who helped so much with scoring some of these tests. They were anonymous still, the names were all covered up, but Chris Covington, Jessica Kilgore, and Marco Ortiz and Brian Althouse were just really helpful in mathematical computation here. And Gloria Spangler has been tremendous in helping me put things together to be here today. And of course, Mrs. Frank, who's put a lot of hours in facilitating this whole group too. With me. Yes, that'll help. You'll see there a piece like this, and you'll see where you fall on that continuum. Generally speaking, those who fall between about 0 and 20 is either way from the 0 line is considered a mild preference. So in that case, it's very easy to transfer from one side of the line to the other and see the other person's point of view and even act out of that side rather quickly.
There you go.
There's a decided preference, we call it, between about 30 and 40. And that's an area where you don't have any trouble deciding what you want to do and which way you're going to act in that particular area. You just sort of do it. And yet you're still pretty open to what other people do, but you know your definite preference. Beyond that, the 40 to 60 area, that's an area where it's very difficult for people to act in another way. They have a very decided preference, and unless they're sensitized, it sometimes causes more conflicts. So you might want to remember that as you look at these. The area between 30 and 40 is sort of that area where you have a definite preference. You know what you want to do, but you can act out on the other side too and understand it. Now, what I wanted to look at for just a minute is the other side of that paper. If you remember your 4 letters, this is the key part to Myers-Briggs, is when you put those 4 letters together. Remember how we talked about those percentages and how they change? How, with the different variations on the group, you could get a very particular group that you fit into, which may be a very small percentage. And so you can look at the other side of that paper that you have with scores you just got back. And because of that blend of being an I and an N and an F and a P, or whatever your blend of 4 letters is, it makes a certain personality type in a way that you deal with the world. The first letter is going to tell you where do you get strength, from being with groups or being by yourself. The second one will tell you whether you go for how you gather information, whether it's intuitive or whether it's through seeing detail. So you might want to read that little description there about what your 4 letters blend together to be. Now, that's going to be very, very brief. And I'm going to leave with Mrs. Frank a folder that has 3- and 4-page descriptions of each of the 16 personality types, we call them. And you can borrow that however she sets up for you to do that, or whether she gives that to the library. I'm not sure how she wants to handle that. But that way you'll be able to learn more about your particular type. because each type is really special and really has a unique contribution to make to the world. If you, that handout you have, the one you got when you first walked in, on one side of it there's a grid like this one. And there's sort of some one-word descriptors there that help describe things. And that's what I put in there. There's one down there that sounds sort of derogatory. It means pedagogue. It's down in the bottom right-hand corner of that area. And that can be taken pejoratively, and that isn't how it's meant. If you look at that description written afterwards, you'll see what it means is somebody who takes a lot of responsibility, and they may end up shouldering too much responsibility on their own shoulders. It doesn't mean that they're acting like God. It just means that they're very responsible, sometimes to the point where it causes them a lot of heaviness. But let me go over these percentages, because it's sort of interesting. You can write these right on that first handout you got. As you go across, I'll read across left to right. If you're an ISTJ, you make up about 5% of the population. If you're a ISFJ, you tend to be very loyal, and you make up about 6% of the population. If you're an INFJ, you tend to be very sympathetic, and you make up 1% of the population, of the general population of the United States. INTJs make up about 1% of the population, and they're very independent people. ISTPs are very skillful with tools. They're artisans, and they make up about 5.8% of the population. The ISFPs are very artistic. They make up about 5% of the population. And that's having an artistic temperament. It doesn't mean that everybody who's artistic can draw well, but it does mean that they have an appreciation and a personality for that type of thing. INFPs are 1.5% of the population. INFPs tend to be non-directed. They tend to go on quests in life and follow things. INTPs tend to be very logical. They make up about 1% of the population. ESTPs are about 13% of the population. And they tend to be promoters, to get involved with things. And they can be rather unpredictable at times. And I think that's what makes life interesting. That's one of the largest groups, and it's sort of unpredictable. ISFPs are very generous folks very often. They're entertainers. They give of themselves. And they make up 13% of the population. ENFPs are optimistic folks. They're called, in the one-word description, journalists. And they make up about 5% of the population. ENTPs are innovative. They're inventors. And they make up about 5.6% of the population. ESTJs make up about 13% of the population, and they're hard chargers. They're administrators. They're the people who move mountains and get things in motion. ESFJs are harmonizers. They make up about 13% of the population too. And the nickname here is seller that's written on your paper. And yet to be a seller, what you're doing is you're harmonizing. You're bringing two parties together. If you think about a real estate deal, you're talking about the buyer and the seller. The buyer wants to pay the lowest price. The seller wants to get the highest price. And so the salesman in the middle tries to get them to harmonize and to agree and come to that one point where the deal can happen. The ENFJ is a persuasive type. They tend to generally feel real concerned about what happens to others and what they want, and try to handle things with due regard to the feelings of others. They make up about 5% of the population. And then the ENTJs are field marshals, the nickname. They command and take charge. And they also make up about 5% of the population. So you can see how the different groups, they all add up to 100%, but they put together a very interesting population, what probably sits in this room. I wish I would have done a cross-section of that, but it would have taken a couple more hours. Go ahead, next slide. The slide again. And we're going to need the lights again. I'm going to go back to that. Good. Now the thing that we need to remember is, in this matrix, we're all one big society. And we can't get along without each other. That's what human relations is all about. We can't get along without each other. And this really points that out. When you think about the sensing types, they need intuitives. And the sensing type, the person who can get all the details, they still need that person who can fit it together to bring up possibilities. What can I do with all these details I got around me? To supply ingenuity on problems. To read the signs of coming change. Because a sensing person is going to see all the details here and now. They're not going to think about the things that come, so they need that intuitive part of ourselves sometimes. They need the intuitive to have enthusiasm, to take on difficult tasks with zest, and to share the future joys that are worth looking for. What do you think Albert Einstein was? Do you think he was a sensing person or an intuitive person? Any ideas? Sensing? Okay. Actually, he was probably intuitive. You think about E equals mc squared, the formula that makes atomic energy use possible. Albert Einstein thought that up. He knew it was right. He just knew it was intuitively. From everything he saw, he knew it was right. But he couldn't tell you why. He didn't have the details to put together to prove it. And it took an Italian mathematician, whose name I forget, to actually prove why E equals mc squared is true. Go ahead, the next one. That's the same one, isn't it? Oh, no. Okay. Now, on the other side, the intuitives need sensing types to bring up facts. You can have a feeling about something and what to do with it, but sometimes you got to know what the facts are, and they have to be brought up, and people have to be reminded. You have to supply experience to problems. You can't just realize what the problem is and think you have a solution, because people have probably tried things before. You need somebody there to say, this works and this has worked before. To read the fine print in the contract. To notice what needs attention now. Not the overall system, but gee, that little cog is getting out of place, or this person's unhappy. If we don't take care of them, they're going to be malcontent and blow the whole company apart. To have patience, to keep track of essential details. You know, a lot of companies and a lot of individuals get in trouble because they don't have good accountants keeping care of the little details. Look what trouble Congress is in right now with the House banking scandal, because people weren't paying attention to details. They were out there with the big problems with it, not those little details. To face the difficulties with realism. We think about thinkers and feelers. Thinkers need feelings types to persuade, to reconcile people together, to teach, to sell, to advertise, to understand, my idea is a great idea. I got this wonderful idea. I got this wonderful invention. But how does it affect people? How can I get people to buy a microwave oven? You know, it took a feeler to market that oven to make it as popular as it is. You know, I could never understand why anybody needed a VCR machine, really, when it first came out. I mean, it's on TV, watch it then, who needs it? But somebody kept marketing that feeling to me. And my friend said, oh, it just feels so good not to watch it when they tell you gotta watch it. So I ended up buying a VCR machine after a while. Thinkers need feeling types. And feelers need thinkers to analyze, to organize, to take. How do we help people? Well, sometimes we need organizations. We need a united way to organize the charities in our town and all the other things, community organizations. How do we organize to help people? To hold consistent renewal policies so people don't feel they're being treated arbitrarily, for instance. So there's a sense of order and fairness. And that's what thinking types bring to the world. What I want you to look at here again is to interpret the score. When you're below about 30 points, it takes more energy to decide which side you're going to use. And on the other hand, you can use the other side fairly easily. On the other extreme, on the over 30-point area, then you need, then it's really easy to make decisions where you're going to come from, how you're going to make decisions. Go ahead. I want you to remember about this test that it doesn't measure intelligence. It's not an IQ test. You're not smart because you're one type or another. It doesn't measure morality. You can be a horrible person morally, do all sorts of illegal things and be any one of these types. Or you can be the most moral person changing the world and working for good and be any one of these types. Pathology, as I said before, it's not a pathology test. It doesn't measure the types of things you see on a Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory or something of that sort. It's none of those. What it does measure is how well developed certain aspects of behavior are, whether you're introverted or extroverted, and it helps you deal with those. Go ahead. These are the types we went over before, so you can skip that one and the next one. Carl Jung said that we spend the first 20 years of our life discovering who we are and developing it to an extent. That's what school's all about, discovering who you are and learning skills that you can use to augment who you are. Then the next 20 years of life, from about 20 to 40, people spend using that skill and developing it, honing it, and really becoming proficient with the way they are. And then it's midlife crisis, age 40. You've got a few years to wait for that, but it will come. And at age 40, it's, I've missed so much of life. What's the other side of life like? And that's when Jung says people go back and develop the other side. If they were extroverted, maybe they start meditating and spending vacations by themselves to find out what the other side is like. And they begin to appreciate the other side a lot more. So you have 3 distinct phases in life according to Jung. You're nearing the end of the first phase. You know pretty much who you are. You've developed that, maybe added some few finishing touches on it. Then you graduate from high school and you're going to practice that and you're going to get it so finely honed you have an impact on this world and the relationships you have with other people. And hopefully these skills you've learned today will help a bit with understanding other people, where they may be coming from. At the bottom of that first handout you got, there's 4 books listed there. If you're really interested in Myers-Briggs and its impact on management, if you go into management, if you go into marketing, inventions, for a whole lot of things, it's good to know your Myers-Briggs types and be able to use them quickly to size up who you're dealing with. When you go in for a job interview, it's nice to know if the guy is sort of an extrovert or an introvert and how you come across to him. Let's go on to the next slide. I want to tell you a couple dangers of the Myers-Briggs. One of them is that you look at your block you're in, and you figure that's the only you there is. And that isn't true. You can develop those other sides and use them. And if you're near the middle of the line, and you take this test 2 years from now, your position may actually change to the other side of the line. But don't get locked in. You have a lot of potential and a world where you can act and be who you want to be. Sometimes it takes more effort than other stuff. You can irritate other people by locking them in. One of the things people do a lot of times during Myers-Briggs presentations, everybody puts a tag on, and you put down your letters, and then you try to relate to each other thinking about those letters for the rest of the day. I didn't do that here today because I really think that we can lock people into blocks that they don't belong in. And a lot of your human relations work today is going to think about that on some other terms too. Do we lock people into blocks because of their race or because of their religion or because of their sex? And for the same reasons, you don't want to lock people into blocks because of their Myers-Briggs type either. You know, we don't want to be labeling folks. You any of you remember the Ford Edsel, the history of it? It was supposedly the most advanced model of its time. It was a dramatic departure from everything the Ford Motor Company was making. And it was going to be a huge improvement. Well, the thing was the biggest flop that ever came along because Ford had just changed so dramatically, it was outside of anybody's comfort area. So if you're comfortable with who you are, don't go to make huge changes unnecessarily. The same thing happened a few years with Coca-Cola. You know, all the bottles now say the original formula because they tried another formula and people didn't want it. And so they had to change it back. Learn new ways to hurt each other. And that's certainly not what we want to do. You know, if you know somebody's an introvert, respect their introversion. If you know somebody's an extrovert, respect the fact that they're extroverted and they can get excited. And all those other scales too. We're here to help people become all they can be. This just talks a little bit about problem solving. And it's a neat little scale you might want to look at here. Where do we get our information? It talks about the SN and then the TF. And if you can learn to use both sides of the line on the SN and both sides of the line on the TF, and you can think through those logically, you will make good decisions almost every time. First of all, sense the details. See, what are all the details around? Then go to your N side and say, how does that all fit together? What does it mean? Then go to your thinking side. See, where do you want to go? How am I going to get there with what I see as a situation? And then check it out on the feeling side. How's this decision going to affect people? If you can run those 4 steps through any problem that you have, you're going to come up with an infinitely better decision than if you short-circuit it and go from the intuitive to the feeling, for instance, or something like that. If you have one of those 4 letter combinations there, that says a little bit about some things that you got to be free sometimes. Other people have to have duty. Other people value confidence. Other people value a search for themselves. And the next one is sort of that same. No, those are the 4. That's what happens when you work in the dark. You don't have your cheat sheet up here. Okay. I guess we can turn the lights back on. So, we're almost near the end of our time. We're getting close to it. Got about 10, 15 minutes left. And I wondered, what type of questions do you have? What type of reaction? extroverts who are real talkative. I've got to ask you, have you ever had an experience where you're with somebody and you talked past, it was like you were talking to somebody and they weren't there because you were talking, it was a different language even though it was English? Did anything register with you today? What might have been going on there? Anybody like to share with us? Continuums, either an extrovert, introvert. It applies to one of those 4 continuums there. And so there were about 20 questions that fit each one. And within those 20, if you scored one of them, you had 2 choices you always had to make. So if it was one of those questions that applied to the introvert, extrovert, then you, if you answered it one way, you're an introvert. If you answered it another way, you're an extrovert. It says, probably like one of the questions may have been, do you prefer to read a book or go to a football game? And the person who goes to the football game with the group would be an extrovert. The person who reads a book would tend to be an introvert. Now, there's some of us who would have no interest in a football game. You know, soccer's our game. So we'd rather read a book. So that's why there's so many questions, because they sort of balance each other out to sort of form an overall pattern. The test has been given probably to at least 500,000 people or more, and it's been given in a number in Japan and Europe. Japanese managers use this, one company in particular, I forget which one it was, that uses it to a whole lot of effectiveness in placing people in their jobs. Where are you going to be happy? That's something that you can do with this too. Take your, for instance, maybe you take in your 11th or 12th grade a career preference test or some other job-related test. Take these results and then look at your job preference test that you take in that grade. And it might give you some insights into what type of jobs you'd like to explore. Yeah, wonderful. You're getting to the major argument going on in psychiatry and psychology today. Is anything biologically based versus experientially based? And I'd say that both go on to some extent. That there's probably some neurology that makes people more likely to be introverted than extroverted, for instance. You know, a certain constitution we're born with. On the other hand, that can be really affected by life experiences. If you've been attacked at some point in your life, you're very likely to become introverted and not trust other people and stay away from them. And we certainly think the thinking feeling may have a lot of cultural bias to us. Why do we get women on one side and men on the other? We want to do something a little bit fun here. Let's go around. We have about 100 people. That's like each of you is 1% of the group. How many of you, if you're willing to share, and like I said, there's nothing bad in any of these, but it's fun to see who signs up for this type of workshop is one thing that happens. And I'll write these down as we go along. It'll be fun to look at, about how many. How many of you are ISTJs? Yay!
One. Damn.
How many of you are ISFJs? Yeah, we got one back there.
Assholes.
How many of you are INFJs? One? Good for you. INTJs. Got one? Any more? Do you have an interest in science? Do you think logically?
Damn, stupid.
Okay. Just because they label that scientist doesn't mean you're a scientist necessarily, but it may mean you have some interest in what science is really about cause and effect. What makes things happen? What makes people tick is another way to put that sometimes. How many of you are ISTPs? 2. Right? How many of you are ISFPs? 2. Yeah. How many of you are INFPs? Okay, 2 of How about INTPs? One,
Said he'd be back in a little
2, 3,
while.
4.
Said he was
Okay.
going to get some lunch.
And that's unusual in a sense, because in this group, that's usually 1% of the population. It's like one of the smallest groups. But in this group, we have 4% of our people. So that says something about maybe being interested in putting details together. Then we have ESTPs. 1, 2, 3, 4. How about ESFPs? 1, 2, 3. Okay. 3 people in that group. How about ENFPs? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You know, it's funny, the title for that is journalist. We have one of those people brought a camera with him. You know? Journalism. Photojournalism. ENTP. Wow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's not as big as the other group, but they all sit together there on the same slide. Okay. How about ESTJ? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then we go to ESFJ. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 ESFJs. And then how about folks, it's getting a little bit loud probably for people to hear. How about ENFJs? 1, 2, 2, okay. And ENTJs? 1, 1. Are there 2 of you back there somewhere? No, okay. ENTJ. What the areas we got the biggest groups in were down in that bottom left-hand corner, those 4. We had groups of 4, 3, 5, and 7. And that really fits because in the general population, those are squares that each have 13% of the population. This means something. When you think about who you're going to pick as a mate, most people who are married for a long period of time will pick somebody who has something different from them, but not a whole lot of different things. They're not going to be totally opposite in all 4 of their areas. But to keep a relationship going, sometimes people need to be different enough to grow and cause each other to grow and have differences to cause excitement. And so there's very often something different, but not a whole everything being different. Any other questions been raised in your mind? Oh, there's a good question. How about, are you more likely to be like your parent or different from your parent? Different? Okay. Why do you think different? Go ahead. I can't, you want to volunteer to answer that? Why are you likely to be different from your parent? How come? You don't see what it does to her. I can appreciate that. My father was a medical doctor, and the last thing I wanted to do in life was be a medical doctor. You know, I wanted to stay away from that blood and gore and guts. You know, biology class, the worm, not for me. How about some of you think it might be you'd be more like your parents? What do you think? Yeah. parents are different, you may be making a conscious choice to be more like one parent than another. There was a teacher who wrote a book I read one time about the Amish. And she said in her classroom when she taught, she had a lot of Amish kids in the classroom, I never hear the Amish kids raising their voices. And the person she said that to, think about it, she said, have you ever heard an Amish parent, adult, raise their voice? And usually speaking in a low voice and that type of thing is a sign of introversion. And so in that case, it seemed to go along, that's a learned, at least from that one type of comment. What, we got 5? 8 more minutes. Okay. So we only got about 5 more minutes. We got about 2 more minutes. Laura, you yeah. Okay. So we got time for about 1, maybe 2 questions. How many of you, we went over what an extrovert and introvert, thinking, feeling, that type of thing. How many of you guessed your type right on the button? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you. That's pretty good. It's not as easy as you think to guess that exactly, because sometimes what we think of as being extroverted is really not. Maybe it's another characteristic that comes out. A lot of times when we think about it, perceiving and feeling are very similar when we think about it. When you get the definitions and really look at those questions, they can turn out to be quite different things. I guess I'll have Gloria want to make an announcement.
Thank you, Mr. Bamberger. We would like to present you with this certificate of appreciation from Student Council for coming today. Thank you.
I saw this before any of you, but it's done on that puzzle format, the way all your signs in the hallway are. That's really great. Thank you. Let me just say, for those of you, if some of your friends didn't get their test back because they were absent, or 2 people turned it in late, I'm going to leave that with Mrs. Frank too, as well as those booklets that describe the personality types more in depth. Thank you so much for letting me be with you today.
Okay, please remain